Nandi couldn't believe she had married her father, the kind of man she detested. She had not seen this coming, for Sandil had arrived wrapped in charisma and charm that made everyone adore him, a gift that concealed the darkness beneath, like velvet draped over broken glass. The realization sat heavy in her chest on this particular autumn morning in Johannesburg, 15 years after she'd said "I do" in a ceremony that now felt like it had happened to someone else entirely. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new apartment in Parkhurst, the very neighborhood where her old life had begun, watching the jacaranda trees shed their purple blossoms onto the streets below. The petals fell like prayers, or perhaps like the remnants of dreams too fragile to survive the weight of reality. Behind her, boxes still needed unpacking. Her children's laughter drifted from their rooms, a sound that had become increasingly rare over the years in KwaZulu-Natal, but was now returning like birdsong after a long winter. That sound alone justified everything. The fear, the uncertainty, the monumental act of uprooting a life she had spent over a decade building in soil that had proven too toxic to sustain anything real. But standing there, Nandi allowed herself to travel back, to trace the map of choices that had led her to this window, this view, this moment of both ending and beginning. She had been 27 when Sandile re-entered her life with the force of familiarity and the promise of possibility. Nandi had been flying then, in every sense of the word. Her work with the multinational NGO took her across the continent: Nairobi, Lagos, Accra, Kigali, each city adding another layer to her understanding of what women could build when given half a chance. She'd returned to her duplex in Parkhurst, to her vegetable garden where tomatoes grew fat and red, to her pool where she'd float on Sunday afternoons with a glass of wine and a good book, feeling the particular satisfaction of a life chosen and created by her own hands. Her social calendar had been full of gallery openings and dinner parties, poetry readings and weekend brunts with friends who had known her since she was 16 and still believed she could be president. They'd gather around her dining table, these women who were doctors and lawyers, and entrepreneurs and artists, and they'd laugh until their sides ached, solving the world's problems between bottles of Merlot and platters of cheese. Sandil had appeared at one of these gatherings, brought by a mutual friend, and the recognition had been instant. They dated on and off through high school and university, that dance of young love that never quite catches its rhythm because the dancers are still learning their steps. But at 27, they were different people, or so Nandi had believed. He was everything she remembered, amplified by time and success. The cattle and abattoir business his family had built over generations was thriving, and Sandile moved through the world with the ease of someone who had never questioned whether there would be enough. He made her laugh. He remembered how she took her coffee. He showed up when he said he would. After the chaos of her travel schedule and the intensity of her work, his steadiness felt like coming home. They dated for 3 years. A relationship that unfolded in the spaces between her international flights and his trips to the family farm. It was fun and uncomplicated, or so it seemed. Dinners at the best restaurants in Sandton, weekends in Cape Town, easy conversations that range from politics to poetry. They fit together in that comfortable way that familiarity allows, like sentences that don't need to be finished because the other person already knows the ending. The pregnancy had been unplanned, but not unwelcome. At 30, Nandi had begun to feel the whisper of maternal longing, though she'd imagined it would come later, more deliberately. But when the 2 lines appeared on the test, what she felt most was a strange sense of rightness. This was Sandile, whom she'd known for over a decade. This could work. Both families had insisted on marriage with a fervor that surprised her. Traditional values ran deep in both their lineages, and the idea of a child born outside of wedlock stirred an urgency that overrode any questions about whether marriage was what either of them truly wanted. The wedding had been small, intimate, a quick gathering of family and close friends. Nandi had worn a dress of cream lace and carried proteas, South Africa's national flower, and told herself that the tightness in her chest was just nerves, just the natural anxiety of stepping into a new chapter. But within months, the chapter had rewritten itself entirely. Sandile's father suffered a massive stroke, leaving the operations of the farm and abattoirs in crisis. As the eldest son, Sandile had no choice but to return to KwaZulu-Natal full-time, to step into the role his father could no longer fill. The timing was catastrophic. Nandi was 4 months pregnant, increasingly uncomfortable, still working full-time, and suddenly facing the prospect of navigating pregnancy and early motherhood alone in Johannesburg while her husband lived 500 kilometers away. The distance had revealed cracks she hadn't known existed. Sandile was supportive in the ways that money could solve. He paid for the best doctors, hired nannies before the baby was even born, ensured Nandi wanted for nothing material. But he wasn't there. Not for the first ultrasound where she heard their baby's heartbeat alone. Not for the nights when fear would wake her at 3 a.m. and she'd lie in the dark wondering how she was going to do this. Not for the moments when pregnancy made her body feel like a stranger's and she needed someone to tell her it was normal, it would pass, she was going to be okay. One particularly difficult evening when Nandi was 7 months pregnant and overwhelmed by the weight of everything, her changing body, her demanding job, the loneliness that had become her constant companion, she'd called Sandile in tears. She'd needed reassurance, needed him to tell her they would figure this out together, that they would find a way to be a family despite the distance. Instead, he'd been irritated, distracted. A disease outbreak was threatening the cattle, foot and mouth spreading from Mozambique, and he was dealing with veterinarians and stressed farmhands and the very real possibility of losing a significant portion of the herd. Her tears had felt like an imposition, her fear like a burden he didn't have capacity to carry. "I didn't want this," he'd said, the words sharp and sudden like a slap. "I didn't want a baby right now, Nandi. This wasn't the plan." The silence that followed had been thick with shock. They'd never articulated it quite that way, had both performed the motions of excited, expectant parents when families were around, had bought the crib and the tiny clothes and acted the part. But in that moment of frustration and stress, the truth had tumbled out, ugly and irretrievable. The argument had escalated, voices rising across the phone line, until Sandile said he was driving to Johannesburg immediately. Nandi had assumed he was coming to apologize, to hold her, to take back what he'd said. Instead, when he arrived near midnight, his eyes were cold with rage at having been forced to leave his crisis for hers. It happened so fast Nandi almost couldn't process it. One moment they were arguing, her swollen belly between them like a witness, and the next his hand had connected with her face with enough force to snap her head to the side. The shock had been greater than the pain. She'd stood there, hand to her cheek, staring at this man she thought she knew, seeing a stranger. Sandile had crumbled immediately, falling to his knees, sobbing, begging forgiveness. He'd never done such a thing, would never do it again. He was just so stressed, so overwhelmed. It would never happen again. Never, never, never. His remorse had seemed genuine, devastating even. And Nandi, standing there with her unborn child moving inside her, had made a calculation that would shape the next 15 years of her life. She would forgive him. For the baby. For the family they were building. Because everyone makes mistakes. Because he'd promised. She never told anyone. Not her mother, not her sister, not the friends who would have stormed the farm with fury and certainty. She absorbed it alone, filing it away in a part of herself she would learn to keep locked and separate from everything else. Their son was born 3 weeks early, a tiny, perfect creature with Sandile's eyes and Nandi's mouth. Sandile had missed the birth, another crisis with the cattle, another emergency that couldn't wait. Nandi had labored surrounded by nurses and her hired doula, and when they placed her son on her chest, the love had been immediate and total and terrifying in its intensity. She named him Tabo, the bringer of joy and happiness, The was Nandi's dream for her and Sandile, and the family they were starting. When Thabo was 3 months old, Sandile proposed that Nandi move to the farm. The business needed her, he said. Their marriage needed her. Their son needed to grow up with both parents under one roof. He painted pictures of a peaceful rural life, of raising their children close to nature, of being a complete family. At 31, after years of flying across continents and living out of suitcases, Nandi had felt ready for something different. The idea of slowing down, of being present for every moment of her son's childhood, held an appeal she couldn't deny. She'd convinced herself it was an adventure. The small town of Newcastle welcomed her with curiosity and eventual warmth. She'd thrown herself into building community, joining book clubs and volunteer organizations, befriending the other young mothers at the local clinic. She'd gotten pregnant again. A daughter this time, strong and serious even as a baby. And then, a few years later, another son. This one with his father's easy charm. The years had a rhythm to them. School runs and soccer matches, helping with homework and planning birthday parties, expanding the house to accommodate their growing family. Nandi had poured her considerable energy into creating a home that felt like a sanctuary. Modern lines softened with rustic touches, a vegetable garden that rivaled the one she'd left behind in Johannesburg. Spaces for her children to play and dream and grow. But underneath the surface of this carefully constructed life, violence had been growing like mold behind walls. Sandile's drinking had increased, a slow escalation that Nandi had initially dismissed as normal. Everyone drank in farming communities. It was part of the culture, the way people unwound after hard days in the sun. But for Sandile, alcohol wasn't relaxation, it was transformation. The charming man would disappear, replaced by someone mean-spirited and cruel, someone who found her flaws with laser precision and itemized them with the dedication of an accountant. The first time he hit her after their second baby, Buzi, was born, Nandi had been so shocked she'd almost laughed. It seemed impossible that they were here again, after the promises, after the remorse. But alcohol, she learned, has a way of erasing promises, of making the unthinkable seem not just possible, but justified. It wasn't constant. Months would pass with peace. Sandile would be the father she'd hoped for, playing with the children, helping with bedtime stories, grilling meat on Sundays while friends gathered around. But then there would be a bad week at work, or too many whiskeys with his friends, and the familiar tension would creep into the house like smoke, making everyone hold their breath. Eventually, Nandi had broken her silence. She told her family during a visit to Johannesburg, the words tumbling out between sobs in her mother's kitchen. Her mother's face had aged 10 years in that moment. Her brother had wanted to drive to KZN immediately. Her sister had pleaded with her to leave, to come home, to bring the children to safety. Both families had converged on the issue with the weight of tradition and concern. Sandile's family had been horrified. This wasn't how they raised their son. This wasn't acceptable. This ended now. Sandile had been given a stern talking to by his uncles, men whose authority he couldn't dismiss. And, to his credit, or perhaps just his fear, the physical violence had stopped. But Nandi's friends, her chosen sisters from Johannesburg who had known her longest, had been less forgiving. They'd urged her to leave, to understand that violence wasn't just physical, that a man who could raise his hand to his wife while she carried his child was not a man worth building a life with. They'd offered her rooms in their homes, money, legal contacts, anything she needed to start over. Nandi had listened to all of it, the concern, the anger, the fear, and made a choice that would haunt her. She would stay. Not for Sandile, not anymore, but for her children. She thought of her own childhood, of her father's absence, of how that emptiness had shaped her and her brother in ways they were still unpacking in therapy as adults. She wanted different for Thabo, for Buzi, for little Sizwe. She wanted them to have a father, a complete family, roots that ran deep into land that belonged to them. So she stayed and she built the business for her children's future so they could do and be whatever they want. What Nandi hadn't anticipated was how good she would be at it. The cattle and abattoir business that Sandil had inherited was profitable but stagnant, running on the same systems his grandfather had implemented decades before. Sandile had no interest in innovation. His passion lay elsewhere, in fishing trips with his friends, in long afternoons at the local pub, in anything that took him away from the responsibilities that felt like shackles. So Nandi had stepped in, initially just to help, to use her business degree and her experience with entrepreneurship programs. But she discovered something. She loved it. The challenge of taking something traditional and making it relevant, of finding new markets and building relationships with buyers as far afield as Saudi Arabia, of creating systems that turned chaos into profit. Within 5 years, she tripled their revenue. Within 7, they were supplying premium beef to high-end restaurants, supermarkets across South Africa, and exporting to 3 countries in the Middle East. The farm that had been profitable became a multi-million rand enterprise, and Nandi became known in agricultural circles as someone who could transform operations. But with her success came Sandil's resentment. He'd stopped hitting her, but he'd found other ways to wound. In front of their children, he'd remind everyone that the business was his, that Nandi was merely helping manage what his family had built. He'd dismiss her ideas in meetings, only to present them as his own later. He'd cut her out of conversations with bankers and buyers, then ask her to fix the problems his decisions created. The children watched all of this, absorbing lessons Nandi had never intended to teach. They learned that success made some people small. They learned that a man could take credit for work he didn't do. They learned that their mother's intelligence and hard work could be simultaneously essential and invisible. What broke Nandi's heart most was watching her children's relationships with their father. They adored him, or at least the idea of him. When Sandile was present, which was increasingly rare, he was fun and engaging, full of stories and easy affection. He'd take them fishing and return with tales of adventure. He knew things about cattle and land and history that fascinated them. They'd wait for his approval like plants turning toward a distant sun, and Nandi would watch them wilt each time he chose his friends and his drinking over them. When she tried to intervene, to ask him to be more present, to prioritize family dinners over pub visits, he'd tell her coldly not to interfere with his relationship with his children, as if relationships could exist without time, without presence, without choosing to show up again and again. Nandi began to understand the generational nature of damage. She learned that Sandile's father had beaten his mother regularly, that Sandile and his siblings had grown up in a house where violence was normal and women's submission was expected. His mother had never left, had never stood up for herself, and that helplessness had been its own kind of inheritance, passing down templates for relationships that were warped and wrong. She looked at her own children and saw the pattern threatening to repeat. Her eldest son, Thabo, was becoming increasingly withdrawn, absorbing his father's emotional absence like a sponge. Buzi had started mothering everyone, taking on responsibilities that weren't hers, trying to fill the gaps Sandile left. And Sizwe, her baby, was learning that love was something you had to earn through being entertaining enough, good enough, worthy enough. When Thabo was preparing to start high school, Nandi had a moment of clarity so sharp it felt like breaking the surface of water after being submerged too long. She looked around her beautiful home, the modern kitchen where she cooked elaborate meals, the spacious living room with its high ceilings and carefully chosen art, the bedrooms where her children slept in expensive linens, and saw it for what it was, a beautiful prison, abundant in everything except the things that actually mattered: happiness, peace, genuine love. She'd built this life so carefully, had sacrificed so much to keep it intact, and what she'd actually created was a showcase of material success that her children were growing up in like plants in a greenhouse, protected but not thriving. Safe, but not truly alive. That's when Nandi began her quiet revolution. She started a new business using all the contacts and relationships she'd built, all the knowledge she'd accumulated about supply chains and international markets. But she registered it under her mother's name, building a completely separate entity that Sandile knew nothing about. Every contract she secured for his business, she duplicated for hers. Every relationship she'd cultivated, she maintained through her new company. She worked twice as hard managing both operations, but the exhaustion was nothing compared to the feeling of building something that was genuinely hers, that no one could take credit for or claim or diminish. For 3 years, she maintained this double life. To Sandile and everyone in Newcastle, she was still the devoted wife managing the family business. But in Johannesburg and internationally, she was becoming known as the founder of an innovative agricultural supply company. Her mother was the official owner, but everyone in the industry knew it was Nandi's vision, Nandi's work, Nandi's success. During this time, something else was happening. Nandi was falling out of love. Or perhaps more accurately, she was waking up from the dream, or delusion, that she'd ever truly been in love with Sandile at all. What she'd felt at 27 had been familiarity and timing and the comfort of a known quantity. What she'd built in her 30s had been determination and duty and the stubborn belief that she could fix something that had been broken from the start. But by 42, with 15 years of marriage behind her, she felt nothing when she looked at Sandile except a mild contempt and a deep exhaustion. They had nothing to talk about anymore. He knew nothing about the business he supposedly ran. His days consisted of fishing and drinking while she built empires. They slept in the same bed but might as well have been on different continents. The final straw came on an ordinary Tuesday. Sandile had been drinking with friends and came home belligerent. He'd started in on his familiar refrain, how everything they had was because of his family, his name, his business. How Nandi should be grateful he'd given her this life. And something in Nandi snapped. Or perhaps something finally aligned. "Take it then," she'd said, her voice calm and clear. "Take the business. It's yours after all. I'm moving back to Johannesburg with the children." The shock on his face would have been funny if it weren't so sad. He'd never actually believed she'd leave. She'd stayed through violence, through neglect, through years of diminishment. Leaving seemed impossible for someone who'd already stayed through so much. But Sandile had called her bluff, or what he assumed was a bluff. He'd taken over the business operations, immediately cutting her off from the bank accounts, removing her from all financial systems. He thought he was punishing her, teaching her that she couldn't survive without him. What he hadn't realized was that she'd been preparing for exactly this moment for 3 years. Nandi had packed up the children. Thabo was 16, Busy 14, Sizwe 12, and moved back to Parkhurst, back to the neighborhood where her independent life had begun. Though to a different apartment, a new space, she enrolled them in good schools in Johannesburg, used her network to make the transition as smooth as possible, and threw herself into building the business that was actually hers. The children had been confused at first, then relieved. In Johannesburg, they could breathe. Their mother smiled more. They made friends whose parents were artists and professors and entrepreneurs, expanding their understanding of what life could look like. They video called their father, but he was distant, uncomfortable with this new arrangement that required him to actually engage, rather than just be present when convenient. Within a year, Sandile had moved his girlfriend into the house that Nandi had designed and built, into the home where their children had grown up. When Nandi heard this through her children who'd been told by their grandmother, she felt surprisingly little. Not anger, not betrayal, just a distant sadness for the man Sandile could have been if he'd wanted to. For 2 years, Nandi focused solely on her children and her business. She rebuilt her network in Johannesburg, reconnected with old friends who'd been waiting for her to come back to herself. She hired therapists for the children to help them process the complicated feelings around their father and the divorce that still hadn't been finalized. She joined a women's business group and found community among other women who'd rebuilt their lives from rubble. But she didn't file for divorce. Not yet. There was a part of her that couldn't quite close that door, that worried about what it would mean for the children, that hesitated before taking that final, irreversible step. Her friends pushed her lawyer pushed her, but it was her accountant who finally convinced her with a practical concern. Nandi, you married in community of property. If you don't divorce him soon, your business could be considered a joint asset. Everything you've built could be split with him. That did it. Not heartbreak, not anger, but the practical need to protect what she'd created. Nandi filed for divorce 2 years after leaving the farm, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting joint custody of the children that Sandile rarely exercised anyway. The divorce proceedings revealed just how far apart they'd grown. Sandile fought for the house which Nandi didn't want. He fought for money from her business, which her lawyers successfully argued was established after their separation. In the end, the settlement was relatively clean. He kept the house and the family business. She kept her business and the Johannesburg property. The children would split their time, though in practice they spent most of it with Nandi. When Thabo was in his final year of high school, Nandi heard through the family grapevine that Sandile was on the verge of losing everything. The business she'd built had collapsed within 2 years of her departure. He'd mismanaged contracts, failed to maintain relationships with suppliers and buyers, and let the operations deteriorate. The farm and abattoirs that had been in his family for 3 generations were about to be foreclosed on. Nandi had sat with this information for a week, feeling the weight of it. She could let him fail. She could watch the poetic justice of his own laziness and arrogance destroying what his family had built. She could feel vindicated. Instead, she drafted a proposal to buy the business from him. Her lawyer had thought she was crazy. Her friends had been concerned it was some kind of trauma response, but Nandi knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't saving Sandile. She was protecting a legacy and creating an inheritance for her children. The contract was carefully structured. A large sum would be protected for Sandile's parents and siblings, ensuring they were taken care of. Sandile would receive enough to clear his debts and start over if he chose to. And Nandi would reclaim the business she'd actually built, the one that bore someone else's name but was hers in every way that mattered. Sandile had signed the papers without much resistance. By then, even his pride had been exhausted by failure. His girlfriend had left when the money dried up. His friends were tired of lending him money for drinks. He was 50 years old and starting over from a position of humility he'd never experienced before. Now, at 49, standing in her Parkhurst apartment, watching jacarandas bloom, Nandi felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years. Possibility. Her children were thriving. Thabo had just finished high school and was headed to university in Cape Town, studying marine biology because he'd inherited his father's love of water but channeled it into science. Buzzy was in her penultimate year of high school and talking about law school, fired up about justice in a way that made Nandi's heart both swell and ache. Sizwe was discovering he had a gift for music, his room full of instruments and equipment, his mind full of melodies. They were genuinely happy now. The shadow had lifted from their eyes. They laughed easily. They had opinions and passions and the confidence to pursue them. They called their father on birthdays and holidays, maintaining a relationship that was cordial but not central. They'd done the work in therapy to understand that his failings weren't about them, that they were worthy of love even when he couldn't show up. Nandi's business had reached a point where it ran smoothly enough that she could step back from the daily operations. She'd hired excellent managers, built strong systems, created something sustainable. For the first time in decades, she had time, space, room to think about what she actually wanted rather than what needed to be done. An old friend, Lwazi, had been circling her orbit for the past few years. They'd known each other for 25 years, had been in the same social circle in their 20s. He'd married young too, had also endured a marriage that slowly poisoned him, had also found the courage to leave and rebuild. He'd asked her to dinner 3 times over the past 2 years, and 3 times she gently declined. Not ready. Not there yet. Too focused on her children and her business. But he'd been patient, showing up without pressure, just being present in a way that felt entirely different from anything Nandi had known. He'd send her articles he thought she'd find interesting. He'd remember things she mentioned in passing and follow up weeks later. He'd made space for her exactly as she was, without trying to fix her, or claim her, or diminish her. Last week he'd asked her to dinner again, and this time Nandi had said yes. She told her children, expecting some reaction, concern, protectiveness, something. Instead, Buzzy had hugged her and said, "Finally, Mama, you deserve to be happy." Thabo had nodded approvingly, saying he'd always liked Lwazi. And Sizwe had simply asked if Lwazi liked music because that was the metric by which he measured people now. Standing at her window, Nandi thought about the girl she'd been at 27, choosing familiarity and comfort, building a life on a foundation that was cracked from the beginning. She thought about the woman she'd been at 32, choosing to stay, believing sacrifice was the same as love. She thought about the woman she'd been at 42, choosing to leave, believing survival was victory enough. At 49, she was choosing something entirely different, not familiarity or comfort or survival, not sacrifice or duty or martyrdom, just possibility, just the radical act of believing she deserved happiness, deserved love that didn't hurt, deserved a relationship built on mutual respect rather than history or children or shared business interests. She texted Lwazi, "Still on for dinner Friday?" His response came quickly, "Wouldn't miss it. I'll pick you up at 7. Nandi smiled, set down her phone, and turned back to the window. The jacarandas were still shedding their blossoms, carpeting the streets below in purple. In a few weeks, they'd be bare, preparing for winter, but after winter would come spring. And they'd bloom again, the way they always did, the way everything did if given enough time and the right conditions. She'd been so many versions of herself, the ambitious young professional, the dutiful wife, the protective mother, the ruthless businesswoman. Each version had been necessary. Each had taught her something. Each had brought her to this moment. Now, finally, she was ready to become the version she'd been moving toward all along. Simply Nandi. Not defined by her relationship to others, not performing roles or meeting expectations. Just herself. With all her complexity and her scars and her hard-won wisdom and her capacity for joy she'd nearly forgotten she possessed. She was 49 years old, and she was just getting started.